Hey folks, more Author Diaries, and I'm continuing to talk about my, hopefully, upcoming novel, Dreams of Fire. And this time I'm going to talk about creating an original species. So this is a fantasy story, and I knew going in that I was going to want more than humans, because a big part of the initial conception was that there's basically the world of humans, which is largely technologically driven. The nature of the technology varies depending on what part of the continent you're on, but that's a world building thing. I got to do that as another video another time. But I also knew that separate from humanity was going to be what I ultimately dubbed the wild world, which is the forests, the mountains, the natural world, and the creatures who dwell in there who aren't... They're not actively at war with humanity, but neither side is a fan of the other. And so I knew I wanted non-human, sentient species. I also knew right off the bat that I didn't want to deal with the standard fantasy races. You know, elves, dwarves, orcs, trolls, goblins, those sorts of things. I didn't want to deal with them. I wanted to deal with something else. So one of the first things that I did was create my own original race, which I dubbed the Treshon. So the Treshon went through a number of revisions over time, largely having to do with their place in the world and how they function and where they come from. And the thing with them was, as initially conceived, I had always thought that there would be some Treshons who have some level of interaction with humanity, because I did want that there, but I had to figure out why. Because one of the characters in the book, a character by the name of Garion, who is a marshal, in other words, basically a bounty hunter, he is half Treshon. Now, exactly how that happens, I'm not sure yet if I'm going to talk about that in this video. I might. We'll see where my brain goes. I don't script these. So I knew I wanted some degree of interaction, so I had to figure out, well, what are the Treshons like? And then before I could sort of, well, I almost had to reverse engineer that from the goal of having, well, there has to be some level of interaction between them and humanity. And so I had to build them from the ground up and then figure out how would anyone even end up as a half Treshon? And then how would that sort of thing work? So the Treshons were basically conceived as a tree-dwelling species. They are shorter than humans. They usually don't get much taller than 3 or 4 feet. So as a result, Garion is only a little over 5 feet tall. They are covered in a very fine layer of short fur from head to toe. The color of the fur will vary, again, depending on what part of the continent they're from, mainly having to do with what forest they primarily dwell in and what color trees they're trying to blend in with. Most of the Treshons in this particular book are gray. In sort of another book set in the same setting and world that I am working on at the same time because I'm nuts, you encounter some with sort of a burnt orange thing going on because the forest that they come from has a primarily different shade of tree bark. But so there's that. They have sort of flattened features. I don't want to say like Voldemort nose, but like the bridge of the nose is little more than a hint of a nose. They have, and this idea, I'll just say flat out where I stole it from. They have retractable talons on their fingers, and they don't go out this way. They come out like that. So they sort of protrude down and curve inward. And I stole that straight up from Spider-Man 2099. And for the exact same purpose. They are basically these thin little razor-sharp things that are retractable, come out of the bottom of the feet, and also the toes, so that they can grip to trees, climb up and down with absolute ease. And then finally, I had their hind legs, because they can move on either 4 or 2 legs equally well. But I had their hind legs, basically, the knee bends in the opposite direction of a human's. And that was just sort of one more way to have them be a little bit less like tiny furry people. So that was the basic conception. And I was happy with that. And I'm still happy with that. But I then realized, well, I need to have more species. And I tried to start to think of other stuff. But I ended up abandoning that fairly quickly in the early conceptions of the world and the book, because I realized that I was basically just creating generic creatures to fit different settings. So I basically just created a water people. I basically just created a mountain people. I was just picking environments like, well, what would this be? I was only doing it to fill out non-human species. I wasn't creating it because like, ooh, I have an idea of where this could fit into this story. I was just doing it so that it wouldn't be only just the Treshon. So as a result, the Treshon are not the only non-human species in the book. They are the only non-human species that I created whole cloth, though. Because the rest are all taken directly from folklore. So you have pixies, you have redcaps, you have kobolds, you have dryads, you have Huldra. If you don't know what those are, look those up. Those are really cool. And I did alter some of these to fit my needs. I tried not to venture too far from like what I understood to be the original folkloric conception of these various creatures. But they are altered for my purposes to varying degrees. And there's a bunch more that I came up with who don't appear in this book, but again, have appearances in the other one, like gargoyles and trow, and a few others. So that helped a lot for me to settle on being okay with having the Treshon there, because now they weren't just the only thing, and I no longer had the pressure of having to create from scratch a whole bunch of other species for no reason other than to have a whole bunch of other species, because I just wasn't coming up with any other ideas that I was particularly happy with. At least not as happy as I was with the Treshon. So then came the question of, okay, you have a half Treshon character, but you've designed the Treshon to be part of the wild world, to be part of the fae, of the fairy creatures, which means they do not have a working relationship with humanity. How the heck do you end up with a half Treshon? Because the normal implication of any half-breed is that, oh, mother, father, different species, they had a child. And that, I knew right off the bat, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. Like, I actually backtrack. In my younger years, when I was still in my 20s thinking of this, I had ideas of like how that might work that I don't actually even want to go into, because thinking back to it now, I'm like, no, that was skeevy and exploitative. Let's not do that. So what I ended up landing on instead is that the way Treshons are created at all, or at least initially, has nothing to do with a mating pair. So this was the other thing that I created, and this wasn't part of the initial conception of the Treshon. This was an idea born out of necessity, trying to reverse engineer, how do I end up with a half Treshon? How does that happen? How on earth can I have this character who I've created and I like and I want to use? How do I justify his existence? So the way it works is that Treshon are, well, back up. Treshon, as an ongoing thing, are capable of breeding within their own group. But that's not the only way that you end up with Treshon, and that's not how they were originally created. Treshon originally, and this does still happen, are stolen human children who are then transformed through fairy magic into the Treshon. So this accomplished a couple things. Well, first of all, this was actually largely inspired by a Lorena McKennett song. I forget which one it was now, but I was just listening to it in the car, and it's this sort of lullaby lulling song to entice a child into the forest. And that just sort of clicked something in my head. And so the way the Treshon now work is that children are lured into the forest, usually by a Huldra, because I've kind of mashed up Huldras and Banshees as far as what I've made the Huldra capable of doing, so they have a bit of a hypnotic voice thing going on. And the child is then lured into a fairy circle, toadstool ring, which is a place that amplifies Fey magic. And once there, they are physically reshaped and reworked into a Treshen. That's why Treshons are as short as they are. It's also, retroactively, because this was already the case, it retroactively became a reason why the Treshen is the only Fey species that doesn't have some form of magical ability. Because, the kobolds basically have effectively earthbending. The redcaps have some degree of telekinesis. Pixies, little bursts of light and can help things grow faster. The Huldra has its hypnotic voice. The Treshen didn't have any magical abilities. And that was always the case, but now suddenly it had a reason for that. They're not actually magical creatures. They were creatures created through magic. And the other thing it does is it justifies, again, a way that I was already using them, which is that they are the most savage towards humans. None of the Fey creatures in this book like humans. Most of them, unless they feel like they are being encroached upon, are content to leave humans alone, except for Treshon. Treshon will actively hunt them down if they are anywhere near a human. And the way I justify that is it is basically a form of self-loathing. The Treshon collectively hate humans more than any other Fae because that is what they come from, that is what they once were. And they resent that. So that is where they come from. So how do we end up with a half Treshon? Well, if you have a child, that magical transformation I mentioned, it's not instantaneous. It happens over time, generally over several hours. And if you recover, if in this case the parents recover the stolen child before the transformation is complete, you have basically someone like Garion, who is a half Treshon. He is taller than any Treshon would be. His sort of internal connection to the Fey world, sort of the sensing of magical energies, he has that, not as heightened as a full-bore Treshon would, but he does have that. He has the back-bent legs, he has the talons, he has the grayish skin, but he doesn't have the fur. So that is how you end up, in my world, with a half Treshon. So that I was able to come up with a way that allowed me a half-breed character without having to have a cross-species mating. And it's one of those things, it's funny when you are working on something long enough. It's often criticized, I feel like, when people feel like an author reverse engineers something. Like, I wanted to do this, how do I justify it? And sometimes that can lead to some very convoluted stuff. Because I think there's a very high praise generally, like, well, what is the organic result of this story you've created? And that's a very noble thing to do. I can't always do that. I know, and this is similar to how I when I've talked about plotting, how I need to know where I'm ending. Otherwise, I can't finish a story. I can't just write a story to see where it goes and see what results. I need to know the destination. Otherwise, I lose steam. So kind of as an offshoot of that, I needed to know what I wanted the final result to be of how I was building this species. And I wanted that final result to be Garion. I needed a way to justify who he was, how he worked, how did he come to be, and his place within human society. Which is basically that the reason he's a bounty hunter is because it's about the only job that he is so good at that human beings will put up with him. Because he is so good at that, because of his heightened senses, because of his ability to basically climb up sheer walls, thanks to the talons, that they can't ostracize him when he is so good at this one thing. Humans still don't like him. He makes them deeply uncomfortable. But he also basically had no other job that he could do that he would be... I think it was Steve Martin who said, be so good that they can't ignore you. And that's basically what he did, but it's the only field in which he could do that. So I knew who I wanted to end up with, and I had to reverse engineer how to get there. And I'm actually super happy with the results. I am really pleased with how Garion turned out, how the Treshen turned out, and it was fun to go back and continue to rework that over years. Because, like, let's not forget, been working on this dang thing for about 18 years to some degree. That 18 years ago was when I came up with the initial kernel of the idea and started world building in a very haphazard way. And then I actually drafted the thing for the first time about 8 years ago. So it has been very rewarding to watch this take shape. And it also re-emphasized to me why it was important that I not bother trying to create any other original species for this story aside from the Treshon. Because I don't think the Treshon would be as refined if I was trying to do this with a half dozen other original species that I did to fill out the world. I think, especially in hindsight, I did myself a massive favor by having all my other non-human creatures be based on, if not direct transpositions from real-world folklore. It took such a burden off me that I was able to focus on this species, really drill into them, and I am so happy with how they turned out. So that is how I worked on and developed and the end result of the original fantasy species that I created. So, I don't know if this was helpful. I don't know if it was interesting. I don't know if any of these are, but whatever your thoughts are, go ahead, drop something down in the comments, and let's talk about it. And these will keep coming out. I'm still plugging away at it, and come on back next time you need a break.